The Royal Navy and Supermarine's first operational jet fighter was the straight-winged, Neen-powered Attacker. It entered service in 1950 and unfortunately it wasn't very good, being quite slow, quite leaden in a dogfight, and rather dangerous to fly. Consequently, it had a remarkably short service life and was rapidly replaced by the Hawker Seahawk, which arrived on decks in 1953. The Seahawk was a little remembered but also an excellent fighter bomber. It served until the 1980s with the Indian Navy. On Royal Navy carriers, the Seahawk was joined in 1954 by the radar-equipped Sea Venom, which was also a very good straight-wing jet fighter. Both aircraft took part in the short-lived and rather embarrassing debacle in Suez. The issue that both of these fine aircraft, the not-so-fine Attacker and the bruising turboprop Wyvern all shared was their wings. By the time that they deployed, it was blindingly obvious that swept wings were the future, and that higher subsonic, high-altitude jet bombers would be the norm within 5 years. Remember that this was the nuclear age and that every threat to a carrier group would be packing atoms, or something like that. It's also worth remembering that this was a period in which the British Empire was particularly skint, if you'll excuse the technical term. The ruinous cost of a Second World War in a generation, the end of empire, and a nuclear arms race meant that keeping the Navy's carriers stocked with the latest jets was rather challenging. But it was also important to keep up appearances. Flying the Seahawk into the 60s would look bad, and neither it nor the Sea Venom could deliver the upcoming Redbeard Special Store. They were just too small and too underpowered for the job. This need would ultimately lead to the Scimitar. Although it didn't see service until 1958, Scimitar had its origins in an earlier problem, namely getting a jet fighter down on a carrier deck in the first place. Amongst the bright ideas that British engineers came up with was a flexible, rubberized deck that removed the need for a heavy landing gear and thus reduced the length of the landing roll, or rather bounce. It was clear that to make the most of the idea required a purpose-built aircraft. Most important, in concept at least, was a flat, broad under-fuselage to maximize the contact surface. As early as February 1945, this requirement was put into a formal specification and issued to Supermarine, who assigned it the model number 505. 505 was 46 feet 8 inches long and had conventional 35-foot span straight wings. Because strong landing gear wasn't needed, they were very thin wings for the day. Large ailerons with lift spoilers aided low-speed control on approach, and dive brakes were fitted to slow the aircraft if it got too close to transonic flight. In order to clear the jet blast, the tail was a butterfly type with the horizontal and vertical tails combined into a single all-moving unit. Moving them differentially allowed the aircraft to be turned. The engines were Rolls-Royce's proposed AJ65, AJ standing for axial jet, 65 standing for the 6,500 pounds of force they gave. Being axial made them slim enough to be fitted flush to the fuselage sides, contributing to the flat underbody. On paper, the 12,200 pound Type 505 was capable of 680 miles an hour at sea level and a 3-minute climb to 45,000 feet. Most interestingly, the new Interceptor was going to be armed with a 4.5-inch recoilless gun, although that was later switched for 30mm revolver cannons that were under development based on the Mauser 213. After some relatively positive experiments with the rubberized deck, carried out using a modified Vampire, the Royal Navy decided that converting its carriers would be too much effort for quite limited benefits. Supermarine's Type 505 was, however, sufficiently promising that the company was asked to add landing gear and submit an aircraft to compete with Hawker's Seahawk as a carrier-borne day fighter for the early 1950s. The new Model 508 had conventional landing gear, but could have it removed if required to land on a flexible decked ship. The wings were therefore thicker, which was beneficial for low-speed handling, as well as accommodating tougher landing gear. The dive brakes moved to the tops of the wings and the span increased by 5 feet. Because the wings were now larger, the tail area also had to increase. Armament flip-flopped from 4 30mm Aiden revolver cannons to 4 Hispanos and then back to 4 Aidens. All of these changes meant that although length was the same as the Type 505, on paper weight increased to just over 14,000 pounds. That's meteor weight, in case you're wondering. When the prototype of this aircraft was constructed, it was discovered that the cannons and the Avon engines were heavier than expected and that total weight was now £18,250. Based on wind tunnel tests, modifications were made to the tail before VX-133's first flight on the 31st of August 1951. Although the heavy, somewhat underwinged aircraft had a high wing loading, tests showed that landing speeds were acceptable because of the combination of leading-edge slats and large flaps on the trailing edge. Takeoff and initial climb performance were both good, but unfortunately the aircraft was slow, barely topping 600 miles an hour flat out. It also snaked quite noticeably at these high speeds because of that butterfly tail. On a test flight in December 1951, the test pilot, Mike Lithgow, experienced 11G vertical oscillations that made him pass out and broke the pitot tubes off the wingtips. He landed the aircraft, though, allowing the engineering team to diagnose a hydraulic leak that had in turn caused the port undercarriage door to open. High-speed air circulating inside the opening caused the violent oscillations. After repairs and fitting of some upgraded components in the hydraulic system and a new undercarriage door lock, the X-133 conducted deck landing trials on HMS Eagle, which went well. Snaking problems were still apparent, though, and they led to the fitment of 7-foot-long strakes on the upper surface of the rear fuselage directly ahead of the rudders. I assume that these modifications were broadly successful, as something similar was fitted to the second prototype, which was completed in August 1952. The X-136 was, however, sufficiently different to 133 to receive a new designation as Type 529. It was longer by 6 inches, had proper fittings for cannons rather than ballast, and space for a tail warning radar. Neither of those systems were fitted in the end because of the program's cancellation in early 1953. That didn't stop both aircraft going back onto Eagle in October and November 53 for more trials. By this point, though, the age of straight-wing fighters was over, so the prototypes were retired. VX-136 was written off in a landing accident. The Hulk was eventually destroyed in gunnery trials. VX-133 was used as a firefighter training Hulk and burnt out. Unheralded though it was, Types 508 and 529 were essential precursors of the eventual Scimitar. The Ministry of Supply had ordered 3 prototypes of the 508. Since Supermarine had been flying a swept-wing Attacker, designated Type 510, since 1948, in 1952 it was decided to complete the last 508 prototype, VX-138, with a swept wing as well. This wing had the full complement of slats and flaps to give low-speed control. Span was 37 feet and 4 inches. Although a swept version of the butterfly tail was initially designed, it was soon abandoned for a conventional all-flying tail that could move through a 15-degree arc. The fuselage of this new Type 525 was lengthened to 49 feet and an inch. The tail stretched things still further to 53 feet all told. The weight of this aircraft really climbed, partly because of the larger dimensions, partly because internal fuel had gone up from 410 robust imperial gallons to 630, and partly due to the fitments of guns and the tail. Maximum takeoff weight climbed to £28,000. Although updated engines gave a total of £15,000 of force, it proved a sluggish aeroplane. First flying on the 27th of April 1954, it went supersonic in a shallow dive in November of that year, but was otherwise resolutely subsonic. It also climbed more slowly than the straight-wing Type 529. Instability at some altitudes led to the fin being enlarged. As well as the testing of the swept wing, Type 525 was also used to test a boundary layer control system that forced air bled from the engine over the trailing edge flaps. This reduced approach speed by 12 miles an hour and would prove highly successful on the Scimitar. Unfortunately, the sole Type 525 was lost in a fatal crash on the 4th of July 1955. Lieutenant Commander Tony Rickle went up to familiarise himself with the aircraft ahead of its carrier trials program. After conducting one low-speed approach at Boscombe Down, he stalled the aircraft during the second, span in and crashed. Apparently he delayed his ejection while trying to save the aircraft, and although Rickle got out, his chute didn't fully open and he was killed. The loss of VX-138 before it had gone on to a carrier set the program back by several years. Acquiring high-performance fighters was a tricky business in this period of rapid advancement. Before the decision to build the 525 had been taken, discussions had also taken place between the Ministry and Supermarine about how even this wasn't likely to meet the original 1947 specification. In May 1953, a modified specification was issued that called for a single-seat fighter intended for interception, combat air patrols, and long-range strike. It was to be a day fighter from a carrier and a day or a night fighter when used from a land base. Supermarine revised the 525 design and produced a new aircraft called the Type 544, which flew for the first time on the 20th of January 1956. This first aircraft was a rush job intended to make up for time lost in the 525 crash. It was therefore something of a hybrid between the later 544 prototypes and its predecessor. Nevertheless, by the start of April, it was headed for Ark Royal for carrier trials. The first landing nearly ended in disaster as the landing mirrors were incorrectly calibrated. Mike Lithgow lined up, but the arrestor hook struck the Ark's stern 4 feet below deck level. Fortunately, both aircraft and ship survived unscathed. When the calibration issue was discovered, it was also found that the mirror was already at its maximum height, so there wasn't anything much that could be done about it. The trials went on, with 29 landings made. Takeoffs couldn't use the catapult because the aircraft wasn't cleared for it. This nearly led to a disaster when Lieutenant Commander Colin Little forgot to take the wheel brakes off his aircraft. The Type 544 staggered off the bow, dropped into the ground effect, and somehow clawed its way skywards. The parking brake handle was subsequently relocated, as it turned out that the pilot couldn't reach it when he was strapped in. The next 2 prototypes were ready in late 1956, and they were representative of Supermarine's design. Unfortunately, they had a host of stability and control issues that required quite major changes to rectify. Wing fences, a sawtooth leading edge to the wing, and flared wingtips designed by the famous German aerodynamicist Dietrich Kuchmann were all needed to control pronounced pitch up at transonic speeds. The tailplane's 10-degree dihedral was also flipped to a 10-degree anhedral, which some sources suggest was the biggest contributor to improved stability. By this point, the type's poor high-altitude performance was understood, and the proposed role had thus changed to a low-level nuclear attack. Unfortunately, the fairy power controls proved too sensitive in this environment, leading to a very high roll rate, and they therefore needed tuning down a bit. Improved feedback was also provided so that the pilot could understand what was going on with the aircraft. The airframe also underwent a process of strengthening so it could absorb the stresses of low-level high-speed flight. Common to other contemporary projects around the world, titanium was used in some areas to keep weight down while retaining heat resistance. This wasn't a simple thing for British suppliers to produce in volume, as they were not exactly rolling in capital to buy new tools. One side effect of the lack of ability to produce advanced materials was the use of steel and the addition of quite a lot of additional strength in the airframe. Even more was needed later as the prototypes suffered from resonance fatigue in their rear fuselages. All of this in turn made the eventual Scimitar very robust, even though its design life was only 1,000 hours. It could pull 6G with 4,000-pound bombs on its pylons. Chemical etching was used to remove some material in order to reduce weight, but Scimitar was always carrying a few extra pounds. The third production aircraft was the first to be fitted with the blown flaps. It carried out the first landings on Ark Royal in January 1957, the major finding of this being that the view over the nose was poor. It was a significant issue as the Type 544 landed very fast at 140 miles an hour. It was heavy too. Typical landing weight was 28,000 pounds, and it could catapult at 34,000. Off a land-based, it could take off at 41,000 pounds. The Seahawk it was replacing could launch at up to 16,000, so you can see the big difference between the 2 generations. The fourth and final Type 544 was fitted with a cut-down nose that would eventually equip the production Scimitar. That name was applied to the type in March of 1957. Tests were concluded by the middle of 1958. The first prototype 544 had an interesting career after the testing. It was used in experiments with underwater ejections using new Martin Baker seats. Lowered into the water from HMS Centaur, it went to different depths for various trials. Finally, totally degraded by the salt water, it was fired from the catapult into the sea as a kind of funeral. The second 544 was simply disposed of. The third was moved around for 30 years and eventually chopped up by the Brooklands Aviation Museum, who sadly only preserved the cockpit. The first production Scimitar had taken flight for the first time on the 11th of January 1957. Eventually 76 were built rather than the 100 that the Fleet Air Arm had originally wanted. Testing of the first prototypes showed a few things about the Scimitar. The lack of high-altitude performance continued to be a feature. 48,000 feet was the absolute ceiling. Climb rate was pretty poor for a late 1950s fighter. It topped out at 20,700 feet a minute when climbing from 5,000 feet, but by the time it got to 30,000 feet, the climb rate fell to just 6,000 feet a minute. As more avionics were fitted, the Type 544 changed sufficiently that it was redesignated Type 560. 63 aircraft were delivered as the original 544 and the remainder were 560s. Irrespective, all Scimitars were known as F1s, regardless of their type designation. They were all single-seaters, all twin-engined. The wings were swept 45 degrees and folded hydraulically. 2 fuel tanks were integrated into each wing, leading edge and trailing edge flaps were fitted. There were fences about 2/3 down the wing and a sawtooth at about 1/3 of the length. The pitot tube was on the port wingtip. The tailplane was raked at 40 degrees and the fin at 45. A pronounced strake extended 2/3 of the way down the dorsal spine to improve lateral stability. All of the flying controls were hydraulically boosted, with all but the tail on a redundant circuit. Hydraulics gave problems throughout its service career. Without perfect maintenance, they would get contaminated and lead to the controls stiffening or even locking, and the hydraulic system leaked quite badly along with other oil systems in the aircraft. The air brakes were slightly unusual. They consisted of 6 small flaps, 3 on each side, just ahead of the jet tailpipe. There were 2 hydraulic systems in the aircraft. Each engine had 2 pumps, one connected to each of the 2 hydraulic loops, so all hydraulic systems could be operated even with one engine out. Heat was synced from the hydraulic systems via coolers that used the aircraft's fuel to absorb it. The fuselage was all metal. It was 55 feet and 3 inches long from nose to tail. There wasn't a radar besides the gun aiming one. Ahead of the nose is a 2-foot-long refueling probe. The cockpit was pressurized, canopy was a sliding type, and it was explosively jettisoned if the pilot needed to eject. 5 further fuel tanks contained in the fuselage held 722 of the Scimitar's 1,064 potent Imperial gallons of fuel. Another 800 could be carried under wing in 4 200-gallon tanks to give 1,864 in total. Those pylons were otherwise rated and used for ordnance. A variety of weapons could be carried. At the simple end, there were 1,000-pound dumb bombs. 2,000-pounders were trialled but never deployed operationally. Clusters of 3-inch rockets could also be carried, 6 per pylon. When operating off a land base, it could carry up to 10,000 pounds of stores if multiple racks were fitted. I don't believe this was ever actually done other than in test flights, though. The most destructive weapon in the arsenal was also pretty simple in reality. A single 25-kiloton Redbeard atomic bomb could be carried on the port inboard pylon, balanced by a fuel tank on the other side. Redbeard was the first nuclear weapon carried by a Fleet Air Arm aircraft. Delivery was queued by labs in a 4G climb. In nuclear attack mode, the cannons and the gun sights were removed, presumably to make space for the lab's hardware. I say presumably because remarkably some of this information is still classified. Guided weapons appeared later in the Scimitar's career. AIM-9B sidewinders were cleared for use in 1963. One could be carried on each outer pylon and they functioned as on any other contemporary aircraft. There were no visual cues because there was no HUD. A growl in the pilot's headset told him when the missile could see the target. The distinctive rattle marked a lock-on. Pilots were instructed to only launch when they could visually confirm the target's identity. For air-to-ground use, Bullpup was also deployed in the early 1960s. Again, one was carried on each outer pylon. It seems that the avionics required to guide the missile were built into the aircraft, as I've not seen a Scimitar with the underwing pod that aircraft like the Super Sabre needed to use Bullpup. To guide the missile, the pilot used a small joystick on the left side of the cockpit. He needed to fly the plane while tracking the missile by means of the 2 flares on its tail. The joystick worked like a kid's remote control car. It would only accept up, down, left and right directions, and then only one at a time. Rudimentary, but better than nothing. A 250-pound warhead wasn't going to do much damage to a hard target anyway. All of those issues and weapons aside, main armament was really the Scimitar's cannons. The Scimitar's 4 30mm Aidens were in fact the heaviest gun armament ever deployed operationally by a carrier aircraft. They laid down more than double the firepower of an M61 Vulcan, thanks to the heavy round and 4 guns firing well over 1,000 rounds a minute. 160 rounds per gun were carried. When they were fired, a scoop opened on the ventral surface to allow in fast-flowing air to cool the guns and purge the bay. Spent links were collected in a tank between the gun bays. All 160 rounds could be fired in one burst if needed without damaging the weapons or causing engine stalls from gun gas ingestion. The Avons produced 10,000 pounds of force each, enough to propel the Scimitar to 727 miles an hour at sea level and 516 at 30,000 feet. One-way range was 1,400 miles. Combat radius was likely somewhere in the 450 to 500 mile range. Number 700X Squadron was the first to get Scimitars in September 1957. They actually took delivery of the first aircraft twice, as it was damaged by a bird strike on its delivery flight and had to be immediately returned to the factory for repairs. 700X was both a type conversion squadron and a snag detection detail. They flew as many hours on the aircraft in as short a time as they could manage. 700 stopped operating the type in 1959. 3 other training flights were equipped with it as well. 764 flew it from February to May 1959. 736, the Naval Air Fighter and Strike School, had Scimitars from June 1959 to March 1965. The last to operate the type was 764, which received its aircraft at the same time as 736, and finally disbanded on the end of November 1965. As more aircraft entered the fleet and pilots were familiarised with the heavy and fast Scimitar, it came time to equip an operational squadron. That task fell to 803 Squadron at Lossiemouth, which received aircraft in June 1958, along with several pilots from 700X. They went to sea on Victorious in September, but the deployment started disastrously. Their CO was first to arrive on the carrier. He made a perfect wire catch, but the arresting wire broke and the Scimitar went into the sea. The plane guard helicopter arrived over the crash site almost immediately, but they found no trace of the pilot. When he was eventually found, it turned out that he had managed to slide his canopy back, but then got snagged by his parachute harness as he attempted to escape the aircraft. 10 Scimitars were deployed to Victorious, which was on its first cruise since a complete reconstruction that had started in 1950 and only concluded in 1958. 12 were the standard complement, but there weren't enough aircraft to go around at this early stage. 803 Squadron had to work through several issues with the Scimitar, related to the strength of its landing gear and the stress it put on the catapults. They also discovered that the aircraft's avionics didn't much like being exposed to heavy rain, and that it leaked so much that buckets needed to be put underneath it to catch the oil before they made the deck too slick. But once fixed, the Scimitar started to prove itself. In mid-February 1959, 803 Squadron took part in exercises against Sea Venoms and Seahawks flying from Eagle, and demonstrated their significant superiority in speed of interception. Later that year, they also had the chance to tussle with Norwegian F-86 Sabres, although the results aren't documented in the Fleet Air Arm records. They were definitely successful against the Skyhawks that they faced when Victorious exercised with the US Navy off Norfolk, Virginia. Of the 18 Skyhawks that attacked the British fleet, all 18 were intercepted and, on paper at least, shot down. The Scimitar was a useful 50 miles an hour faster than the Douglas fighter. 803 came the closest to using the Scimitar in combat. In June 1961, there were fears that Iraq would attack Kuwait. Funny how history repeats itself. On the 9th of July, Victorious duly delivered 803 Scimitars to the Al-Madi and Farwania airfields in Kuwait, where they took up patrols until the crisis faded away in October. Scimitars went all over the world, with 803, 807, 804 and 800 squadrons, turning up everywhere from Singapore to Aden, Gambia, Cape Town, the US and so on. As well as Victorious, they deployed on Hermes, Ark Royal and Centaur. Numbers of aircraft in the squadrons varied, ranging between 8 on Centaur and Hermes and extending to 16 on Ark Royal at the end of its service life. The aircraft were heavily used and accidents began to rack up. In one remarkable period between the 1st of January and the 17th of February 1968, one pilot, Sub-Lieutenant Z.K. Skrodsky, wrote off 3 Scimitars while flying off Ark Royal. In the first incident, the ship heeled after Skrodsky had caught the arrestor wire. The aircraft was released and rolled off the deck edge. Fortunately, only the nose wheel went over, but the damage was significant enough that the aircraft wasn't repaired and was instead broken down for parts. On the 28th of January, he was approaching the deck again when his aircraft suddenly pitched up. Skrodsky ejected and was recovered. Finally, on the 17th of February, Skrodsky was 30 miles from the ship when his Scimitar suffered a hydraulic failure and a fire. Again, he ejected, and thankfully, again he was rescued. Sadly, his luck ran out on the 31st of October 1969. He was flying a two-seat Hunter at Lossiemouth when the high-pressure turbine failed and a serious fire developed. Skrodsky ejected, but he was killed. He was just 24 years old. In total, 39 Scimitars were lost in accidents. That's 51% attrition and amongst the highest rates suffered by a contemporary aircraft. There are two mitigating factors in the Scimitar's defence, though. First, the small fleet was very heavily used because the Fleet Air Arm didn't have many high-performance fighters available to it. Second, Scimitars were operating off carriers that were really too small for them, like Victoria, Centaur and Hermes. They had to land very hard, and if something went wrong, there wasn't much space to get airborne again. In saying that, it should be said that between March 1960 and September 1961, 804 Squadron flew almost continuously off Hermes in the Med, the Gulf, the Indian Ocean, and then off Hong Kong and the Philippines before they went back to the Atlantic and the Baltic. Not one aircraft or pilot was lost. By early 1964, though, the Scimitar was regarded as functionally obsolete. Buccaneer S-1s replaced them as strike fighters. But the early Buccaneer was underpowered and they couldn't always be catapulted with a full load of weapons and fuel, so a special squadron was formed, designated 800B, and affiliated with 800 Squadron. It was a dedicated refueling squadron that saw the Scimitars carrying a Mark 20A flight refueling pod on their starboard inboard pylon. The pod carried 145 gallons, which could be replenished from the aircraft's internal fuel supply. They operated from Eagle for 17 months until the arrival of Buccaneer S-2s in August 1966 made the buddy tankers unnecessary. I think I'm right in saying that these were the only Scimitars that operated from Eagle. In essence, the Scimitar was an aircraft that served for just 6 years, despite the significant cost and time spent developing it. That wasn't actually all that unusual in the period, as several transitions were taking place in the West, most notably the switch from subsonic to supersonic aircraft, and the expectation that all fighters would be all-weather capable and thus have multi-purpose radars. The Scimitar obviously didn't meet either of these new requirements, but it did raise the speed of Fleet Air Arm carrier fighters by nearly 100 miles an hour, and was an education in swept-wing aircraft operations. Better still, by not attempting to integrate advanced electronics, it could be deployed more easily, was cheaper to operate, and less expensive to procure. It was therefore quite a good interim. Finding aircraft to compare the Scimitar to is slightly challenging. It entered service nearly 5 years after the Grumman Cougar, was 50% heavier, 70 miles an hour faster, had 50% more range and significantly heavier armament, so it's not really a particularly good comparison. It entered service at the same time as the McDonnell F-3H Demon. The Demon was an all-weather interceptor with a radar and the dubiously valuable ability to launch the early Sparrow. Scimitar was slightly faster, had better gun armament and 30% more thrust in a slightly lighter package. I actually think the Demon is a slightly underappreciated aircraft, but for all intents and purposes the Scimitar was a more effective daytime fleet defense fighter in anything other than a high-altitude interception. Obviously at night the Demon was superior in an air-to-air role, but it wasn't much of a fighter-bomber. The Skyhawk, which entered service around 1956, was a better strike fighter by virtue of its ability to lift more stores and a lighter package. It was, however, not a fleet fighter bomber, being too slow for interception missions. The Scimitar needed to be multi-role because of the restricted space aboard a British carrier. Dassault's Étendard is the other obvious comparison, being a carrier-based day strike aircraft. It also appeared at around the same time as the Scimitar. Although versions of this aircraft served into the 1990s, the early 4M model was 50 miles an hour slower than the Scimitar. It could lift less than half as many stores. It was a useful 10,000 pounds lighter at maximum takeoff weight, but it also had less than half the thrust. The potency of the Scimitar's engines was actually a strong point of the design. It's unfortunate that the Avons weren't paired with a more aerodynamically sophisticated airframe. As an American pilot once remarked, only the Brits could build an airplane with so much power and still remain subsonic. The nuclear mission and the increasingly complicated task of penetrating enemy air defences or operating guided munitions meant that the workload for a single pilot was also becoming unsustainable. A second crewman was therefore needed to make an effective carrier fighter for the 1960s. So the Scimitar was replaced by the Sea Vixen for interception, and as I said, by the Buccaneer for strike. Its short career means that Supermarine's last fighter is little remembered, which is a shame, because there was a time that it was arguably the best carrier-based fighter in the world.